In part two of the Quiz 1 material, we'll be again covering material from history of psychology, specifically psychophysics, introspection, structuralism, and functionalism, and then briefly touching on some of the different types of psychology. So you might have noticed that in class, whenever I talk about concepts that you might end up generating from Quiz 1, I often, maybe even always, use the example of psychophysics as one that I think you're going to have trouble with. The definition, study of the relationships between physical stimuli and the perception of those stimuli, that means nothing, I think, to a lot of people. And when people actually asked about psychophysics, they said, hey, can you give an example? So I think, as I've talked about in class, coming up with self-references, and in this case, me coming up with a self-reference for you guys is going to be pretty helpful to try and understand this. I am going to do two things. One, I'll go into a little bit of detail and tell you about how psychophysics researchers used to do their research, and then I'll give you kind of a modern day version of a technique that's an awful lot like psychophysics. Some of you will have had this experience, so that's the approach. Okay, so back toward the beginning of psychology, researchers essentially needed to figure out, how does the outside world get into the head? And so there is physical energy out in the world, there is light energy, there is air molecule vibrations, and those things get perceived as sights, vision, and sound. And how do changes in that physical world out there, how do they get reflected in our minds? Okay? And so really what the psychophysics researchers were trying to do is just kind of break down into these very, very basic forms. What can we perceive? Okay, so it works like this. Imagine that you are a research participant in an old psychophysics study. They would put you into a completely dark room, and then they would flash a really, really, really dim light. And they would ask you, can you see the light? You say no. So they flash a slightly brighter light. Can you see the light? No. Slightly brighter. Can you see the light? No. Eventually, the light's going to be bright enough for you to say, yep, I can see it. See, that is the minimum amount of physical light energy that's required for you to be able to say, I can see the light. That's it. That's what psychophysics researchers did. I can play a sound, really, really, really dim, soft sound. Can you hear it? No. Make it louder, make it louder. Eventually you'll be able to say, yeah, I can hear it. So that, you can see that's the relationship between the physical stimuli, how bright is the light, how loud is the sound, and your perception of it. Can you see it? Can you hear it? Real life nowadays, self-reference kind of example for it. Because of a medication that I have to take, I have a very, very extensive ophthalmological exam every year. I'm due for it in April. As part of that, I get to sit in a contraption where I put my chin in a chin rest, and I'm staring at a blank screen in front of me. And what they do is then flash little red lights. and I have to press a clicker. It's like a little mouse every time I see a light. Sometimes the lights are bright enough for me to see them. Sometimes they are not. Right? The purpose of the exam is to see if there's any damage to my retina. But again, that's essentially the same technique that psychophysics researchers used to use. Second concept is introspection, and it's worth pointing out that introspection is something that was pioneered by a guy named Wilhelm Wundt. Remember, for me, you do not need to know people's names unless I specifically tell you. You need to know a person's name. You don't need to know Wilhelm Wundt's name. I just wanted you to hear it pronounced because the W's are pronounced like V's. He is widely credited as being the person who established psychology as a scientific discipline, and that idea will become important in a minute when I tell you a little bit about the introspection technique that he developed. So you might remember from the lecture I gave on the Why Science material, I said that introspection is the key type of what we would refer to as a non-empirical observation, an observation that does not occur in the outside world. Instead, it occurs in your own head. That's what introspection is. It's examining the contents of your own consciousness. And what Wilhelm Wundt did is kind of trained his research participants in a specific technique for trying to break down the individual parts of their consciousness and report it that way. So let me go back up here for a sec. And so he helped to establish the field of experimental psychology by serving as a strong proponent that psychology could be an experimental field. Okay? What Wilhelm Wundt was actually trying to do was model psychology after a discipline like chemistry, right? So think about chemistry where you've got compounds that are made up of individual constituents, different parts, so different molecules. He was trying to break down consciousness in that same way. What are the individual parts that make up our consciousness? So, for example, if you imagine yourself on vacation, you would separate the sights and the sounds, and maybe you can even imagine different smells. So you're going to take those different parts apart and then report them separately. And again, that's simply it. That's what introspection is. That actually does lead us kind of directly to the ideas of structuralism and functionalism. All right, so what Wundt was doing, again, in trying to create like a mental chemistry was what became known as structuralism. Let's take the brain, let's take the mind, and let's break it down into its structure. What are the different parts of our mental life? There's vision, there's sound, there's reasoning, there's problem solving. There's all these different specific activities, specific different parts that our mind has. Okay. There is a modern version of structuralism that still exists, and that would be something like cognitive neuroscience. What cognitive neuroscience researchers currently try and do is identify the specific brain areas using techniques like functional magnetic resonance imaging, but the specific brain areas that are responsible for different activities. Right, let me put you in an MRI machine. Let me ask you to memorize a series of words, and then let's have you recall that series of words. What are the specific brain areas that are active when you are committing that information to memory? Right, that's the structure, the brain structure that's involved in doing that activity. Functionalism is sort of arose as a contrasting idea to structuralism. People who had this functionalist view, they didn't care about the structure of the brain. They didn't care about what were the individual parts of our mental life. What they cared is, what's the purpose? Right? Why do we have these things? Why do we have memory at all? Right? For example, you'll notice that functionalism is or was influenced by Darwin's evolutionary theory. We will be covering evolutionary psychology a little bit later in the semester, and that is really the key modern day equivalent, the key modern day version of functionalism. So, for example, think of something like fear of the dark, right? A common characteristic of the minds of children. Okay, a functionalist would say, "Hey, the purpose of fear of the dark was to keep our ancestors' children safe." Right? Think about it. Yeah, 10 million years ago, there were some human ancestor toddlers who were not afraid of the dark. So they would wander off at night, they would get eaten by some wild animal, they would get lost and die. Okay. On the other hand, some of our human ancestor children were afraid of the dark. That made them stay close to their parents, and their parents kept us safe. Therefore, the idea is fear of the dark served the function of keeping kids safe. Okay, so to finish up this week's hybrid lecture, let's focus a little bit on some different types of psychology, specifically the ones that are mentioned in the History of Psychology module. So I went through, I think I picked out the main ones, and let's kind of give you a brief definition and then examples from each one. Some of these we actually talked about a little tiny bit already on actually the first day of the semester. Also, some of these are things that we'll be covering in a great deal more detail throughout the semester. So it's not necessary that we go into a lot of depth now. These will become clearer as time goes on, I promise. Okay. But these are in the order that they appear in the textbook. So individual differences. I guess the thing to realize here is that most of psychology deals with the idea that people are alike, right? Everybody has memories. Everybody has the ability to solve problems. Everybody has the ability to form emotional attachments with their parents, right? So the bulk of attention in psychology is placed on those characteristics that we share with each other as human beings. Individual differences part of psychology says, hey, wait a minute, come on. Everybody's not the same, and it actually makes some sense to pay attention to the differences that people have. The two most common topics in which individual differences are a key focus are intelligence, right? So how do people differ from each other in terms of their intelligence? Something that we're really only just going to briefly touch on as part of one of the later modules. And then personality. we do have a module on personality traits. So how do people differ from each other with respect to their conscientiousness, with respect to their willingness to try new things, etc. Okay, second, Gestalt psychology. Gestalt psychologists were a group of researchers who started in Germany, and I believe that they, almost all of them, maybe even all of them, ended up coming to the United States around the time of World War II because they were fleeing the Nazis. Gestalt psychologists have kind of two lasting contributions. One is actually not mentioned in the textbook, but I think it's really very interesting, so I'll share that one with you. And that's their discoveries about problem solving. And then second is the ideas related to perception. Let's do the problem solving part first. They discovered a phenomenon that was known as insight. And it is probably something that you have experienced before. You ever had a problem that you're trying to solve and you just can't do it, whether it's a school problem or some kind of real life challenge that you're facing, and you just can't solve it. Okay, so you give up and you go off, maybe you go for a walk, you go do something to get your mind off it, and then all of a sudden the answer just pops into your head. The solution pops into your head. That's insight. The Gestalt psychologists discovered it, and interestingly enough, they discovered it in chimpanzees. All right, so picture this type of study. You got a chimpanzee in a cage, and there's a banana outside of the cage. The chimpanzee wants the banana. Right? Chimps are kind of mean, as you might know. And so you can imagine this chimp getting pretty frustrated. Tries to reach through the bars of the cage. The banana's too far. Okay? Chimpanzee has a stick inside the cage. And you ever heard that animals can't use tools? It's nonsense. Of course they can. So the chimpanzee picks up the stick and reaches out to try and get the banana, but the stick is too short. Okay? Chimp gets really frustrated, but then apparently after a while just gives up. Right? Goes off, does something else. Okay? And then suddenly, I mean, you can just tell the answer to the problem has just popped into that chimpanzee's head. So something that I didn't tell you is there's a second stick. Okay, it's a longer stick, and that stick is outside of the cage. So the chimpanzee takes the short stick, reaches out, pulls in the long stick, picks up the long stick. That's long enough to get the banana, pulls the banana in, and gets to eat it. All right. Insight, first demonstrated with chimpanzees, later replicated with human children, and of course, it's the sort of thing that you've probably replicated in a sense in your own life when you've experienced it yourself. The second key contribution of the Gestalt psychologists was in the area of perception. They're the originators of the term that I discovered my students are not particularly familiar with this term, but it's really quite famous. And the idea is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Okay? So the idea here is when you are perceiving something, you're not just seeing a bunch of parts. You're actually adding those together, and you're contributing to that perception yourself with your own mind, with your brain. Okay? I think the best way to illustrate that is with an example of it. So, to most of you, or maybe not, maybe all of you, that looks like a big triangle. Okay? But it's not a triangle. All it is some parts. All right? We got 1 part, 2 part, 3 part, 4 part, 5 part. Right? Those are the individual parts. Okay? But we see a lot more than that. We see the entire object. Okay? It is our brain that is adding to that. So we're seeing a whole, a triangle, that is more than just the sum of those individual parts. The Gestalt psychologist identified different strategies that our brain uses to do that. Okay? It's something that I have available to talk about later in the semester when we cover perception, and it depends on how much time we have as to whether or not we'll go into some more detail about that or not. Okay, cognitive psychology. This is one that I did mention briefly. So here we've got cognitive psychology, the study of mental processes. I like to think of it as your everyday thinking. Right? It's the part of psychology that deals with things like, and just give you a list of topics: memory, solving problems, language, logical reasoning, statistical reasoning. Remember, we mentioned that the other day, something that we're not very good at. Those are all things that we do on an everyday, on a daily basis, just kind of the mundane, right, the everyday thought processes that we have. That's what cognitive psychology is. We will see very, very soon, Quiz 2 starts covering some of those topics. So the next few, Quiz 2 and Quiz 4 in particular are the main quizzes that will cover cognitive psychology. Behaviorism, that comes in the middle. That's actually Quiz 3. The study of behavior. Oh my gosh, what an unhelpful definition. Okay. I hope you don't mind because you're going to be reading it really, really soon anyway. Just think of behaviorism as the topic of the learning and conditioning module, Quiz 3. It's called classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Okay? Classical conditioning is how we learn that two things out in the environment are associated. Operant conditioning is how we learn that the behavior that we engage in is associated or linked with its consequences. Lots of details coming up soon, but again, just think behaviorism, it's that learning and conditioning module. Okay, and then finally applied psychology and clinical psychology. Really, if you just think of applied psychology as the areas of psychology where we are specifically trying to solve an actual problem. Right? A lot of the research in psychology over the years was simply just to build the knowledge base, to figure out, what are human beings like, what are the different brain activities that we have, okay, without any specific need in mind. Just we want to know, okay. Applied psychology, I have a problem. I want to solve that problem, right? So I want to, if I'm in the military, I want to figure out how I can sort my cadets into the right program so that they are going to be successful. So we developed techniques for selecting people for particular jobs. That's a problem that applied research was able to help solve. And this is what the major parts of human resource, or some of the major parts of human resources are today. Techniques that were developed through applied psychology. You could also think of marketing, at least part of marketing, as an example of applied psychology. As a marketer, I might want to increase demand for my new product. What sorts of messages can I get out in front of consumers that will cause them to want my product? Right? There's my problem. Applied psychology. And then, of course, the major type of applied psychology that we're all aware of is clinical psychology. So using psychological principles to help people who are suffering from mental illnesses, who are suffering from the effects of stress and anxiety, etc. Okay, so again, we've got our specific problem, people who are suffering from problems, issues, and the psychology. We can do research that can help us to discover cures for people, and then of course we apply those cures. Okay, so I think we are done. So this will be the conclusion of the Quiz1 outside lectures, and of course stay tuned to the research designs material that we will cover in class. See you soon.